The late afternoon sun hung low over the Nevada auction yard, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. People moved from pen to pen, talking loudly, making offers, and arguing about prices. Cal Weaver stood among them, but he felt slightly out of place. He wasn't usually the sort of man who enjoyed crowded auctions. He preferred quiet mornings on his ranch, early rides across open land, and the simple comfort of routine. Today, though, he had come hoping to buy supplies, nothing more. He needed fencing materials and maybe a few tools. Horses were the last thing on his mind. But as Cal walked past the livestock pens, he noticed a small crowd forming near the far end of the yard. Curious, he stepped closer. A trader in a faded hat was struggling with a rope, trying to lead out a young filly. The horse was thin, dusty, and clearly nervous. Her ears flicked back and forth, and every muscle in her body seemed to tremble. She wasn't misbehaving, just frightened, unsure of her surroundings, unsure of the people watching her. The trader tugged the rope again, but the filly only stepped backward, pressing herself against the wooden railing as if she wished she could disappear through it. A few men laughed quietly, shaking their heads. To them, she was nothing more than a difficult animal that nobody wanted to deal with. Cal was about to walk away, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the way the filly's eyes moved wide, searching, and filled with a kind of sadness that reached places inside him he didn't expect. Or maybe it was the memory of another young horse he had once rescued years ago. Whatever the reason, he didn't turn away. The trader noticed his gaze and grinned. "Here, take her," he said with a half laugh, pushing the rope toward Cal. "She bites." The crowd chuckled. Not cruelly, but with the easy humor of people who didn't think the filly mattered. To them, a nervous horse was simply an inconvenience. But Cal didn't take the rope. He lifted his hand slightly, signaling he wasn't accepting the offer. "I'm not looking to buy a horse today," he said calmly. The trader shrugged. "Nobody else is either. She's too much trouble." "You look like you can handle her." Cal didn't answer. He wasn't offended, but he didn't like the way the trader spoke about her as though she was nothing more than a burden. The filly's ears swiveled toward Cal, and her eyes settled on him for a long moment. He didn't move closer. He simply stood still, letting her see that he had no intention of pushing her around. For a brief second, something changed in her expression. Her trembling didn't stop, but her eyes softened. Just a little. Cal noticed it, and it struck him more than he expected. A man beside him whispered, "That one's wild. Not worth the feed." Another responded, "Yep, best to leave her." Cal knew they weren't trying to be unkind. They were simply being practical. A rancher's work was hard enough without adding a difficult horse to the mix. But Cal also knew that sometimes the animals labeled as trouble were simply animals who had never been given a fair chance. He walked a few steps closer, slow and steady so the filly wouldn't feel cornered. Her head lifted slightly, and she pressed her weight against the railing again. Unsure whether to trust him, Cal kept a respectful distance. "What happened to her?" he asked the trader. The man shrugged. "Came from a place that didn't have time for gentle training. That's all I know. She's skittish. Doesn't like people much. Hardly anyone's been able to get close without her snapping." Cal took in the filly's small frame. She looked younger than he had expected, maybe 2 years old. She wasn't aggressive. She was afraid. There was a big difference, and Cal knew it well. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level but still keeping distance. The filly's breathing slowed for a moment, as if she wasn't sure whether she should fear him or feel curious. He didn't reach out or try to touch her. Instead, he simply looked at her gently. "You're not a bad one," he said quietly, though mostly to himself. The trader rolled his eyes. "Well, if you think that, you should take her home." Cal almost smiled. The trader was pushing hard, but Cal didn't mind. What bothered him more was the way the filly seemed resigned to whatever happened. She didn't fight wildly or bolt. She just stood there, small and tense, as though she had learned that life didn't expect much from her. Cal stood again and stepped back. "I didn't plan to buy a horse today," he repeated softly. The trader sighed and looked at the filly. "I'll give her to you for almost nothing. I just need her off my hands." The men around them exchanged amused looks, and someone whispered, "He's trying to make that fella take her." Cal heard them, but he didn't react. Instead, he watched the filly. Her tail flicked nervously. Her ribs showed just slightly. She wasn't injured, and she wasn't broken, just unsure, just waiting. It occurred to Cal that she must have been waiting for a long time. He thought of his ranch, quiet, open, peaceful. He pictured the pastures stretching under the wide sky, the gentle routines of feeding and grooming, the steady rhythm of ranch life. A place like that could soften a horse's fears. He had done it before. Not every animal responded quickly, but most eventually learned that kindness could be trusted. He didn't buy horses on impulse. He didn't buy trouble. But as he stood there, looking at the filly, he felt something inside him tilt. Not a decision, but the beginning of one. Still, he didn't reach for the rope. The trader, sensing his hesitation, pushed it forward again. "Go on. You look like a man who can give her a decent place." Cal didn't like being pressured, but he also knew that the trader wasn't wrong. If the filly went unsold, she might be moved again, shuffled from place to place, never handled gently enough to learn confidence. With each change, her fear would grow deeper. Cal exhaled slowly. He didn't touch the rope, but he asked, "Does she have a name?" The trader snorted. "Name? No. She's just a problem horse." Cal's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't like that answer. Every creature deserved better than to be dismissed so easily. The filly shifted her weight, lifting one front hoof in a small, uncertain step. It was the first movement she had made that wasn't driven by fear. Cal noticed it immediately. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt meaningful, almost like she wanted someone to see her as more than trouble. Behind him, another buyer muttered, "Walk away, man. She's not worth it." Cal didn't know why, but those words settled the matter in his mind. He finally reached out not to grab the rope, but to rest his hand lightly on it. The filly hesitated, her ears flicking back again, but she didn't snap or flinch. She watched him closely, as though she was trying to understand what kind of person he was. Cal gave a small nod. "All right," he said, almost to himself. "I'll take her." The trader blinked, surprised. The crowd whispered again, this time with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Cal paid the small price the trader asked, far less than what most horses at the auction went for, but Cal wasn't thinking about money. His mind was already on the quiet ride back to the ranch, on the first steps toward earning the filly's trust, and on the long, patient work ahead. When the trader let go of the rope, the filly took a step back. Cal didn't pull or push. He simply held the rope gently, giving her time. After a moment, she stopped retreating. Her breathing steadied, and she lowered her head just an inch. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was a beginning, and as Cal walked her slowly out of the auction yard, he knew one thing for certain. He hadn't planned to buy a horse that day, but somehow, this small, frightened filly had chosen him just as much as he had chosen her. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, except for the soft sound of the trailer shifting behind Cal's truck. Every now and then, he glanced in the side mirror to check on the filly. She stood stiffly inside, her ears alert, her body tense. She wasn't used to trailers. That much was clear, but she wasn't panicking either. She simply watched everything around her with wide, uncertain eyes, as though she was trying to understand what was happening and whether she should fear it. Cal drove slowly on purpose, avoiding sudden bumps or sharp turns. He didn't want her first experience of traveling with him to feel stressful. He hummed quietly to himself, an old habit he had when working with nervous animals. The tune wasn't special, just something he remembered from childhood. But the soft sound filled the space around him with a sense of calm. By the time he reached the long dirt road leading to his ranch, the sun had dipped lower in the sky. The land stretched wide on both sides, fields covered in warm evening light. It was a peaceful place, the kind of land that made people breathe easier. Cal hoped the filly might eventually feel the same. He parked near the barn, stepped out of the truck, and listened. The filly's hooves shuffled lightly inside the trailer. She wasn't kicking or pushing, just quietly shifting her weight, unsure of what would come next. Cal walked to the back, unlatched the door, and opened it slowly. The filly blinked against the change of light. She lifted her head, taking in the new surroundings, the open sky, the smell of hay nearby, the quiet hum of ranch life. "It's all right," Cal said softly. "Take your time." He didn't pull the rope or try to guide her out. Instead, he stood to the side, waiting. The filly hesitated at the edge of the trailer. Her front hooves planted firmly on the wooden floor. She stretched her neck forward, sniffing the air, searching for clues about whether this place was safe. Finally, after a long pause, she took a small step. Then another. Her hooves touched the ground, and she blinked up at the wide sky. She seemed surprised by the openness around her, as though she hadn't seen anything like it in a long time. Cal watched with quiet patience. He could almost feel her fear and curiosity mixing inside her. He knew this moment wouldn't turn her into a calm, trusting horse right away. But it was an important beginning. He led her to an empty paddock near the barn, a place where she could settle safely without feeling crowded by other animals. The fence was strong and high enough to make her feel secure but not trapped. Inside the paddock was a clean trough filled with water and a small pile of hay. Cal opened the gate and stepped aside, giving her space. She didn't rush in. She took her time, sniffing the grass near the entrance before stepping into the paddock. Her ears flicked in all directions, alert to every sound, the rustle of wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft creak of the barn door. After a few minutes, she lowered her head and sniffed the hay cautiously. Cal watched her, leaning lightly against the fence, his hat pushed back slightly. He didn't speak much, just allowed her to explore. Eventually, she took a small bite of hay. Then another. It wasn't confident eating, more like she was checking whether the food was something she could trust, but she was eating, and that alone felt like progress. Cal stayed by the fence until the evening shadows grew longer. He wanted her to get used to the sight of him nearby without feeling pressured. He understood that trust wasn't something he could demand. He had to earn it slowly, gently, with consistency. Before heading inside, he whispered, "Good night, little one. You're safe here." Inside the house, he made a simple meal, but his mind was still out in the paddock. He wondered what kind of life the filly had lived before the auction. He thought about her thin frame and the way her eyes held more caution than curiosity. Horses usually showed curiosity first, unless they had reasons not to. He wondered who had owned her before, what kind of training she had or hadn't received, and why she reacted the way she did. Not knowing her story made it harder, but it also made him more determined to create a new, better one for her. After dinner, he stepped outside again. The sky was dark now, painted with stars, and the air was cooler. When he reached the paddock, he saw the filly standing near the far corner. She wasn't pacing or restless. She was simply standing quietly, her head lowered in thought. She lifted her head when she saw him. Not with excitement, and not with fear, just recognition. He found comfort in that small acknowledgement. "Just checking in," he said softly. "I'll let you rest." The next morning, Cal rose before sunrise as he always did. Ranch work didn't wait for anyone. But before heading to the cattle fields, he stopped by the paddock. The filly was awake, her coat brushed with the pale pink light of dawn. She watched him approach, her ears tilting forward in a shy but cautious manner. He placed fresh hay in the paddock and refilled the water trough, all while speaking gently to her. She didn't come close, but she didn't step away either. Small steps, important ones. Over the next several days, Cal made a routine of spending time near her paddock whenever he could. He didn't rush her or crowd her space. He would lean against the fence while mending equipment or talking softly so she could grow used to the sound of his voice. Sometimes he brought a brush, holding it where she could see, but never forcing her to approach. One morning, she walked toward him just a few steps. Her neck stretched out, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air around him. Cal stayed very still. She didn't touch him or the brush, but she didn't retreat either. When she finally stepped back, He felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She's getting curious, he told himself later while cleaning the barn. Curiosity meant she was starting to feel a little safe. And safety was the foundation of trust. As the week went on, Cal noticed more small changes. She no longer jumped at the sound of a swinging gate. She stood closer to the fence when he approached. When he spoke to her, her eyes softened instead of widening with fear. He found himself thinking she needed a name. A name felt like a sign of belonging, a sign that she was part of the ranch family. But he didn't want to rush that either. He wanted the right name, something that fit the way she carried herself: quiet, observant, cautious, but not hopeless. One evening, he sat on a hay bale near the barn and watched the sky change colors. The filly was standing in the paddock, watching a bird circling above. She followed it with calm, steady eyes. "You like to watch everything," he murmured. Just like a rook bird. The word felt right as soon as he said it. Rooks were clever, careful, always observing before acting. The filly was the same. She wasn't reckless or wild, just thoughtful and unsure of people. He smiled to himself. "Rook," he whispered. "That suits you." From that day on, he called her Rook. And even though she didn't understand the meaning, she responded to the sound by lifting her head and listening more closely. Her ears would tilt forward in a way that told him she recognized the gentle tone he used when he said her name. Little by little, Rook changed. Not in big ways yet, but in subtle shifts in the way she stood, the calmness in her breathing, the trusting seconds when she let him stand closer than before. She wasn't a different horse, but she was becoming a more comfortable one. Cal knew the road ahead was long. He knew there would be moments when she might fear again, or take steps backward, but he also knew that kindness, time, and patience could reshape a life. Even one that had started in uncertainty. Rook had a long journey ahead, but for the first time, she was walking it in a place where she was understood. The first real sign of progress came early one morning when Cal walked to the paddock carrying a small bucket of grain. The sky was soft with the colors of sunrise, and a cool breeze moved across the ranch. Rook stood near the middle of the paddock, calm but alert as always. When she saw Cal approaching, she didn't move away as she used to. Instead, she lifted her head and watched him with quiet curiosity. Cal set the bucket down inside the fence and backed away slowly, giving her plenty of space. He didn't want her to feel trapped. For a long moment, Rook didn't move. She studied him as if trying to understand his intentions. Then she stepped forward, one gentle step, then another until she reached the bucket. She lowered her head and began to eat. Cal didn't speak. He simply watched with a warm feeling growing inside him. It wasn't about the grain. It was the trust behind the action. Rook was allowing herself to relax around him, even if only a little. For the next few minutes, Cal stood quietly by the fence. Rook flicked her ears toward him from time to time, but didn't move away. When she finished eating, she lifted her head and looked at him for several long seconds. Her eyes were softer than before, no longer filled with the sharp edge of fear. "That's my girl," Cal whispered. Over the next days, Cal began spending even more time near her. Sometimes, he sat on a small stool outside the paddock, mending ropes or cleaning tack, while talking gently. Other times he walked around the fence, letting her follow him with her eyes. She seemed fascinated by simple things: his slow steps, the way he spoke, the way he never made sudden movements. One afternoon, he placed a brush on a low post inside her paddock. He didn't touch it to her, just left it there for her to investigate. Rook kept her distance at first, but later in the day, when Cal watched from afar, she stepped closer to the brush and sniffed it. She nudged it lightly with her nose, examining it like a puzzle. Cal smiled at the sight. "It's just a brush," he said softly. "Nothing to fear." Progress continued this way, small, patient steps. Trust wasn't something Rook gave quickly, but she was learning that Cal wouldn't pressure her. She noticed everything he did. She watched how he moved among the cattle. She observed how gently he treated the other horses. Slowly, she began to understand that he was different from the people she had met before. One day, Cal opened the paddock gate and stepped inside. He didn't walk toward her. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the ground a few yards away. Rook stared at him, her tail flicking lightly. She didn't panic. She didn't bolt to the far side. She simply observed. Cal stayed quiet, letting the warm afternoon pass peacefully. Rook lowered her head to graze, glancing up every so often to check on him. After a long while, she took a few steps in his direction. She didn't come close enough to touch, but she closed the distance by half. Cal pretended not to notice. He knew that staring directly at her or reaching out too soon could break her confidence. He simply sat still, breathing calmly. "Whenever you're ready," he whispered. By the end of the week, Rook was comfortable walking near him as long as he didn't try to touch her. She would stand beside him for short moments, her body relaxed, her ears forward. Cal felt grateful for every inch of progress. One morning, however, something unexpected happened. When Cal entered the paddock with a bucket of fresh water, Rook walked up behind him quietly. He didn't realize she was so close until he turned and found her standing just a few steps away, her eyes gentle. She wasn't frightened. She was curious. "Hello there," he said softly. She didn't move away. Instead, she lowered her head slightly, as if asking a question he didn't fully understand. Slowly, carefully, Cal extended his hand, not to touch her, only to show it. Rook sniffed his fingers, her warm breath brushing his skin. Cal froze, letting her decide what came next. She sniffed again, then gently touched her nose to his palm. It lasted only a moment before she stepped back, but Cal felt something shift inside him. "That's trust," he whispered. "Real trust." From that day on, Rook behaved differently. She began greeting Cal at the fence when he came with feed. She walked closer to him during his quiet visits, sometimes standing so near he could hear her steady breathing. It wasn't that she was suddenly tame. She still had worries, still watched everything carefully, but she was willing to let him into her world. Cal started introducing simple exercises from outside the fence. He would lift a rope slowly, letting her watch. He would set a saddle blanket over the fence so she could sniff it. He didn't rush. He wanted her to understand each new object before he used it with her. One evening, while the sun painted the sky in soft golden colors, Cal brought the brush inside the paddock again. This time, he held it loosely, not too close to her. Rook tensed for a moment, then relaxed. She stepped forward, sniffed the brush, and hesitated. "You know this," Cal whispered. "It's nothing scary." Slowly, gently, he lifted the brush toward her shoulder. Rook trembled, unsure. But she didn't move away. Cal touched the brush to her coat very lightly, just a whisper of contact. Rook froze but didn't bolt. Cal stroked once, then stopped. "That's enough for now." He stepped back, giving her space. Rook blinked at him, confused but thoughtful. For the first time, someone had touched her without force or fear. That small moment became the start of a new chapter for her. Each day, Cal brushed her a little more, just a few strokes at a time. Rook slowly learned that the brush brought comfort, not harm. Eventually, she began leaning into the grooming sessions, closing her eyes while he worked the knots from her coat. Cal felt honored by her growing trust. Their bond deepened in ways Cal didn't expect. When he spoke, she listened, her ears turning toward his voice. When he moved, she followed at a respectful distance. When he stood still, she stood beside him, peaceful and calm. One afternoon, a light rain fell across the ranch. Rook lifted her head, watching the droplets land on the paddock fence. Cal approached her with a blanket, holding it loosely so she could see it. She sniffed it, then allowed him to drape it gently over her back. "That's my brave girl," he said softly. She looked calmer than ever before. Cal felt a sense of quiet pride growing inside him. He had trained many horses in his life, but Rook was different. She didn't learn through pressure or tough lessons. She learned through consistency, patience, and gentle encouragement. He realized that she wasn't just a horse with a fearful past. She was intelligent, sensitive, and thoughtful. She understood more than people gave her credit for, and she wanted connection. She just needed someone willing to earn it. One cool evening, Cal stood with her in the paddock as the sky darkened. Rook stepped close enough that he felt her warm breath on his arm. She nuzzled his sleeve softly. A tiny gesture full of meaning. Cal rested his hand lightly on her neck. Not to control her, simply to let her know he was there. Rook didn't move away. She stood beside him, completely at peace. "You're not that frightened filly anymore," he whispered. "You're becoming something strong." Rook flicked her tail and leaned into his touch. It was clear now. Trust had taken root. The path ahead would still require patience, but something powerful had begun to grow between them, a partnership built not on force, but on understanding. And Cal knew, deep down, that Rook was ready for the next steps. The day of the storm began quietly, almost calmly, as if the sky was hiding a secret. Cal woke early, expecting an ordinary day of ranch work. The air was cool, and the morning breeze carried the smell of rain from far away. Rook stood in her paddock, her coat clean and shining from the grooming Cal had given her the day before. When she saw him, she lifted her head and walked toward the fence with slow but confident steps. "Morning, girl," Cal said, smiling as he placed a small treat in his hand. She reached for it gently, touching his palm with her soft nose. Moments like these still felt special to him. They were small reminders of how far she had come from that frightened filly at the auction yard. After feeding the animals, Cal prepared to ride out to check the fences along the northern pasture. Clouds were creeping across the sky, thick clouds, darker than usual. The cows didn't seem bothered yet, but Cal knew storms could change things quickly on open land. By midday, the sky had shifted into a heavy gray blanket, covering the sun. The wind picked up, brushing dust along the ground. Cal felt the first drop of rain land on his arm and knew he needed to hurry home. He guided his horse back toward the ranch, the wind growing colder with each minute. When he returned, he moved quickly through the barn to make sure everything was in place. He tightened latches, secured the feed bins, and checked that all the animals were sheltered. Rook watched him from her paddock, her ears flicking at the rising whistles of wind. "You feel it too, don't you?" Cal said softly as he approached her. Rook stepped closer and nudged his shoulder with surprising confidence. Just then, a loud rumble rolled across the sky. Rook lifted her head sharply, her ears turning toward the sound. But she didn't panic. She only breathed faster, watching the sky with alert attention. "It's all right," Cal whispered. "Just a storm." But the storm wasn't small. The next clap of thunder shook the ground so strongly that leaves rattled in the trees. Raindrops began to fall in wide, heavy splashes. Cal hurried to move Rook into the barn before the rain grew stronger. She followed him willingly, stepping into the shelter without hesitation. He closed the barn door behind her and gave her a comforting pat. "Stay here, girl. I need to check the lower field," he said. Ranch life required quick decisions during storms. Fences could break, water could rise too quickly, and cattle could wander into unsafe areas. Cal grabbed his coat and stepped into the rain. As he walked away, Rook poked her head over the stall door, watching him as if she understood that something important was happening. The rain became stronger by the time Cal reached the lower field. Trees swayed, the wind howled, and thunder rolled in long echoes. He could barely see 20 feet ahead, but he soon realized what had happened. Part of the wooden fence had fallen. A few of his cattle had squeezed through the opening and were wandering dangerously close to a rocky slope on the east side of the field. Cal's heart tightened. He needed to bring them back before they strayed too far. He turned around, preparing to get one of his trained horses from the barn. But when he reached the barn door, he found the horses restless and uneasy from the storm. Only one horse seemed calm enough to ride, and that was Rook. She stood quietly in her stall, her eyes alert but steady. When she saw Cal, she stepped forward, ears perked. As though sensing he needed help, Cal hesitated. He had never ridden her before. They had practiced trust on the ground. But riding was a different step, one that usually required months of preparation. But time was short, the storm was growing worse, and the cattle were at risk. Rook lifted her head and looked directly at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only readiness. Cal took a slow breath. "I don't want to rush you, girl," he murmured. "But we don't have much choice." He opened the stall gate gently. Rook didn't step back. Instead, she walked toward him, steady and calm despite the flashes of lightning outside. Cal placed a hand on her side, letting her feel his presence. She didn't flinch. With careful movements, he placed a soft saddle blanket on her back. Rook tensed for a moment, remembering unfamiliar sensations, but she took a deep breath and relaxed again. Cal slowly set the saddle in place, watching her closely. She shifted her weight, but didn't resist. "You're doing great," he whispered. When it was time to put the bridle on, Rook lowered her head slightly to help him. Cal felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. This wasn't just obedience. This was trust, true trust offered freely in a moment of need. The rain was pouring hard now, sounding like thousands of tiny footsteps running across the barn roof. Wind blew through the cracks, carrying the scent of wet earth. Cal knew he had only a small window of time. He led Rook outside. The moment the rain touched her coat, she twitched but remained steady. Thunder cracked loudly overhead. But Rook didn't shy away. She simply turned her ears toward Cal. Waiting. "All right, girl," he said softly. "Let's try this." He placed his foot in the stirrup, moving carefully so he wouldn't startle her. She lifted her head but didn't move away. Slowly, Cal swung his leg over her back and settled into the saddle. Rook stood perfectly still, her legs planted firmly, her breathing deep and calm. "You're ready," Cal whispered, feeling gratitude fill his chest. They moved out into the storm together. Rook stepped carefully at first, adjusting to the weight on her back, but within seconds, she walked with confidence, matching Cal's guidance, as though she had done this many times before. Rain soaked her mane, and wind pressed against them. Yet Rook stayed focused. They crossed the lower field quickly, her hooves steady against the softened ground. When they reached the broken fence, Cal guided her toward the cattle. Rook didn't hesitate. She moved smoothly, responding to Cal's gentle signals. Each time lightning lit the sky, Cal felt Rook hold firm under him, as if she had decided her purpose was to stay steady, no matter what. She circled the wandering cattle with surprising grace, helping Cal guide them away from the rocky slope and back toward safety. Even when the wind shifted and rain grew heavier, she didn't falter. Together, they brought every cow back through the gate. Cal fixed the fence temporarily with a rope, knowing it would hold until the storm passed. When the work was done, Cal patted Rook's neck, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "You saved us a lot of trouble today," he said, his voice warm and proud. Rook lifted her head as if she understood. They returned to the barn slowly, the storm still strong but no longer threatening. Rook walked with steady confidence all the way home. Once inside, Cal removed the saddle and rubbed her coat dry with a towel. Rook leaned into his touch, breathing softly. The storm outside continued to roar, but inside the barn, everything felt peaceful. Cal rested his forehead gently against her neck. "I knew you were special," he whispered. "But today, you showed me something incredible." Rook closed her eyes for a moment, her calm presence filling the quiet space between them. Cal realized then that their bond was no longer just growing, it had become something strong, something unshakable. And after today, nothing would ever be the same. The morning after the storm felt like waking into a new world. The air was fresh and cool, washed clean by the night's heavy rain. A soft mist hovered above the fields, and sunlight stretched across the damp grass in long golden lines. Cal stepped outside with a quiet sense of calm. Everything around him glistened, as if the land itself had taken a deep breath after the long storm. His first thought, however, was not about the fields or the fences. It was Rook. He headed toward the barn, where she had slept safely. When he pushed open the door, he found her standing near the front of her stall, completely awake and waiting. She lifted her head when she saw him, her eyes warm and steady. It was as if she somehow understood that the two of them had shared something important the night before. "Good morning, girl," Cal said softly, stepping toward her. Rook took a few steps forward and nudged the edge of his sleeve with her nose. This simple greeting made Cal smile. It still amazed him how far she had come from a frightened, uncertain filly to a horse who now looked at him with quiet trust. He brushed her coat slowly, carefully working through the tangles formed by the rain. Rook stood still, occasionally shifting her weight or closing her eyes when the brush moved across her neck or shoulders. She looked calm, peaceful, and proud. And Cal couldn't help feeling proud right along with her. When the brushing was done, he rested his hand gently on her neck. "You did more than I ever expected yesterday," he whispered. "You were brave. You were steady. You were everything a good horse could be." Rook flicked her ears toward him, as if listening carefully. Cal chuckled softly. "I mean it." Word of the night's event traveled quickly through the nearby valley. Ranchers often talked after storms, sharing stories about what the weather had done and how their livestock had handled it. And soon enough, people began stopping by Cal's ranch. Not out of trouble, but out of curiosity. They had heard about the quiet filly he'd bought for nearly nothing. They had heard how she had helped him gather cattle in the middle of a storm, something even well-trained horses sometimes struggled with. And naturally, many people wanted to see her for themselves. One afternoon, a rancher named Tom dropped by. He leaned against the paddock fence while watching Rook graze in the soft grass. "That the same horse from the auction?" he asked in disbelief. "That's her," Cal replied. Tom whistled softly. "She looks different now. Calmer. She's filled out some too. Hard to believe she's the same filly that kept everyone at the auction on their toes." Cal nodded. "She had a tough start. Just needed time." "You planning to sell her?" Tom asked casually. Cal paused and looked at Rook. She lifted her head and watched him with those thoughtful eyes that never seemed to miss anything. He could almost see the path of the past months, reflected in them: fear, curiosity, trust, and growth. "Not a chance," Cal finally replied. Tom chuckled. "Figured you'd say that." Over the next week, others came too, some curious, some genuinely impressed. A few even asked if she was for sale. One man offered a price far higher than anything Cal had paid for her. But Cal only shook his head. "She's not for sale," he said each time, never once feeling tempted. But the moment that surprised him most came when the same trader from the auction yard arrived unannounced. The trader stood near the paddock, tipping his hat as Cal walked over. "Word travels fast," the trader said with a small smile. "Heard that little filly of yours did quite a job during that storm." Cal didn't respond right away. He simply nodded and waited. "She looks good now," the trader continued. "Healthy. Brighter. You've done well with her." Cal looked at Rook standing a short distance away, her coat glowing in the afternoon sun. "She did most of the work herself." "Well," the trader said slowly, "if you're ever thinking about selling her, I'd be willing to pay a good price. Much more than what you bought her for." Cal felt a quiet laugh rise inside him, not unkind, just amazed at how things had changed. He rested his arms lightly on the fence and shook his head. "I appreciate the offer," he said politely, "but she's staying right here." The trader sighed, then nodded with acceptance. "Didn't think you'd sell, but had to try." He gave a final, respectful nod and walked away. Cal stayed by the fence for a while, watching Rook move gently across the paddock. When she noticed him, she walked over and rested her head lightly on the top rail. It was a gesture she had never offered before, a sign of complete comfort and connection. He stroked her forehead, feeling the warmth of her trust beneath his hand. "You changed your whole world," he murmured. "And mine too." Life on the ranch settled into a smooth rhythm again. Rook became a regular part of Cal's daily work. He continued training her slowly, never pushing too hard. She learned to follow commands with grace, learned to carry a saddle without fear, learned to respond to the softest touch on the reins. Each new lesson she absorbed with quiet intelligence. But it wasn't just training that grew. Their friendship deepened in ways Cal hadn't expected. Sometimes, when the day was long and Cal felt tired, Rook would walk beside him, matching his steps. Other times, she would stand near him just to share a peaceful moment, her presence steady and comforting. One evening after finishing chores, Cal walked up a small hill overlooking the ranch. Rook followed behind him freely. No rope, no pressure, just by choice. They reached the top of the hill as the sun was setting, coloring the sky with soft blends of orange and pink. Cal sat down on an old wooden bench, and Rook stood beside him. He watched the horizon quietly before speaking. "You know," he said with a thoughtful smile, "I didn't plan to buy a horse that day at the auction. I didn't even plan to walk near your pen. But something told me to stop. Something told me you needed someone." Rook lowered her head and nudged his shoulder gently, as if answering him in her own simple way. Cal continued, his voice soft. "Turns out, I needed you too." The breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers, and the fading light wrapped everything in a warm glow. Rook stood calmly beside him, her tail swaying lightly as she breathed in the quiet evening air. Looking at her now, it was almost impossible to believe she was once the trembling filly everyone avoided. She had grown into a confident, steady, deeply loyal partner. And Cal realized she had become something more than just a ranch horse. She was a part of his life in a way he hadn't seen coming. A companion, a friend, a reminder that trust, once earned, could change everything. As the stars began appearing above them, Cal stood up and gently stroked Rook's neck. "Come on, girl," he said. "Let's head home." Rook walked beside him down the hill, their steps falling in quiet harmony. And in that peaceful moment, Cal understood something clearly. He hadn't meant to buy her, but she had been the best decision he never planned to make. And she would stay with him not because she owed him anything, but because they had built something rare and honest together. A bond made of patience, a partnership made of trust, a story that had only just begun.